Welcome, everyone, to Journeys to the Books of the Prophets. We are continuing on chapter 10 in Shmuel Bet. Tonight, we will be doing 3 chapters. We're going to go through chapter 10 very, very quickly because chapters 11 and 12 are among the most important in the life of David. And this is the whole incident of David and Batsheva, are given over in chapters 11 and 12. And we will be delving into that very deeply. So chapter 10 is really one incident where David hears that the king of Ammon has died. Ammon were one of the nations bordering Israel to the east. And his son Hanun became king. And David wanted to send a delegation to, in Jewish tradition, is what we call a shiva call, to give consolation. And the reason was because when David was being chased by Shaul, at a certain point, his father and mother and brothers joined David, but David was in constant danger. And so David went to the king of Moab, who he thought would be a decent place to get his family out of harm's way. Well, it turned out it was not a great decision, because David then left because he's still on the run from Shaul. And it turns out that the king of Moab killed his father, mother, and brothers, except for one brother who escaped to Ammon. And the king of Ammon protected him. And so now that he died, David wanted to send a delegation to his son to express remorse and to thank him for saving his brother. But it didn't turn out that well. The delegation goes to Ammon, and the advisor to the king said, why would we accept such a delegation? David is probably sending them to spy out the kingdom so he can attack us. And so the king regrettably listened to them. And what happened was he cut off half of their beards and half of their clothes. And he sent them back to David, obviously saying, I don't trust you, and you should be happy I'm not killing your delegation. But this was a tremendous insult to, obviously, the people. Can you imagine? Someone's grown their beard their whole life and then has it half cut off. And so they were embarrassed to even show themselves in public. And so David told them that they should wait near Jericho till their beards grow back, and then come back to society. And in short, because I don't want to get too much into this because we have a lot more to learn about David and Batsheva, that a war breaks out between Ammon and Israel. And Yoav, who is the general we've discussed before, he's David's general, is leading the war. And just in short, they win the war. And at one point, though, Yoav is having a difficult time. And so David joins the battle. And he was such a great warrior, he turns the tide and they win the war. And then some other forces join Aram, and are now fighting. And here it says that at the turn of the year, which is interpreted to mean in the spring, the kings come against Israel again. And this time, David sends Yoav. This is the beginning of chapter 11 already. David sends Yoav, but it says, and he was successful. And it says simply that David stayed in Jerusalem. Now, this is unusual because one of the, call it path-setting influences of David is he always led the battles. He didn't stay in the back and let other people fight his battles. He was a great warrior, a great strategist. But here, he stayed in Jerusalem. And the commentaries talk about this because the very next thing is, it says in the second verse of chapter 11, that it came to pass one evening that David arose from his bed and he was walking on the roof and he saw a beautiful woman bathing. And this woman was very, very beautiful. This begins the whole incident with Batsheva. And so the commentaries say kind of like, well, if David would have gone to war like he usually went to war, he wouldn't have been there to be walking on the roof to seeing Batsheva. And that's we'll call it the juxtaposition. Because why did they have to even say that David stayed in Jerusalem? Others say that he was just waiting, like other times, to see how the battle was going. If he needed to join it, he would be the first one there. Others say that he was waiting for his delegation that had their beards cut off, because they were like, it was so traumatic for them. And David felt responsible that he didn't want to leave Jerusalem because he had word that they were going to come and be reintegrated into society. And he didn't want to leave them without him being there. So as always, there are many different commentaries why the Torah had to tell us this. Nonetheless, David is up on the roof and he sees Batsheva. Now, it is very possible that we will not be able to go through this whole incident in depth. So I think what I want to do is I'm going to tell the whole story of these two chapters, and then we're going to go back and try to fill in the deeper understandings. I think it's best that we see the whole picture, and then we start filling it up. Therefore, if we don't finish tonight, we'll be able to continue from where we are. So David goes up on the roof, and he sends a messenger to find who is this woman. And he gets word back that it's Batsheva, the daughter of Elam, the wife of Uriah HaChitti. And when he gets word, again, I'm just going through the simple story here. David sends messengers to bring her to him. It says that she went and purified herself, meaning she went to the mikveh. She came, they had relations, and she went back to her house. The very next verse is that she conceived. And so obviously between verses, 2 months went by, 3 months went by, not clear. She sends word back to David, I'm pregnant. What happens now, and again, I just want to get the whole picture out here, is that Uriah, her husband, is in the army. He was not there when David and Batsheva had relations, and he wasn't there that whole time, up to the time that she became pregnant. He is at war and in the army. And so David sends a message to Joab to send Uriah back to him. Uriah comes, and we'll fill in who Uriah is. But Uriah comes to the king. The king asks him, "How are you doing? How is the war going? Go home," and it says, "and wash your feet." Now, this was just a saying like, I'm giving you a little vacation. Go home and be intimate with your wife. This is your chance. You've been in the army for a few months. What is David trying to accomplish here? He wants Uriah to sleep with his wife and then hopefully hide the fact that she's pregnant from him. Okay, it doesn't say any of that in the text, but it's absolutely clear that that's what's happening. So what happens? Uriah does not go home. He sleeps outside of David's home with the rest of the guards. Why? Uriah is an incredibly dedicated to the king and Israel and the army. And even though the king told him to go home, he felt it was inappropriate. Israel's still at war. And he's going to go home as if nothing is happening. The next morning, David is told, Uriah didn't go home last night. So David calls him back and asks him, "Why didn't you go home?" Uriah says, what I just explained. How could I go home? We're still at war. I'm dedicated to my army, to my people. So David now wines and dines him. It even says he gets him drunk. And he, in a certain way, commands him to go home. Uriah doesn't go home. He goes out, he sleeps there, and David understands he has a problem here. So he writes a message and he sends it with Uriah to Joab. Now, of course, Uriah doesn't look at the message. It's sealed. He brings the message back. The message is, put Uriah in the front lines, that he will be killed. He says it explicitly. To make a long story short, it's a very difficult battle. Joab puts Uriah in the front lines. Many people actually get killed because it's a very tough war. And among them is Uriah. So Joab sends a message back to David saying it's been a difficult battle. We drew very close to their forces and many people died. And he says to the messengers, when David asks you, why did you get so close? Why did we have to lose soldiers? Why couldn't you have used a different strategy? Then you should answer him, this is the best that I can do. And by the way, Uriah was killed. David reacts and saying, send a message back to Joab. I understand completely. Don't worry about it. Okay, this is all in chapter 11. Chapter 11 ends with a very important statement that Once David hears that Uriah is dead, so Batsheva also hears. And it says that she mourns him. After her period of mourning, David sends for her. They get married, and she has a child. So obviously, months have gone by here, in between the lines here. And she became his wife. She bore a son. And then it ends by saying, V'yera hadavar asher asa David be'enei Hashem. But this thing that David had done was very evil in God's eyes. God now sends for Natan the prophet. And he says, go to David and say to him the following parable. But David doesn't know it's a parable. Natan comes and says, David, we have a situation here. There's two people. One is a very rich man. He has all the riches in the world. And among his kind of people living on his land was a very, very poor man who has just one lamb. One lamb. And the lamb gives him milk. And it describes that it's just not any lamb. It's just like his best friend. It's just, he's just so close with this lamb. By the way, I just want to mention for people who came on late, because it's a fast day, I have to make it to Mincha and Ma'ariv, and therefore there will not be a discussion group, and I will not be able to look at the chats. You can put your chats in and we'll share them as we always do, but I will not have time. Okay, let's continue the story. And what happens is a guest comes to the rich man, and the rich man, instead of taking one of his lambs to prepare for a feast, he takes this lamb of the poor person, just takes it from him. And when David hears this, he's outraged. And he says, that person deserves to die. And then Natan says, you are the person. In other words, David didn't realize that this was like a parable. He says, you are the person. And then he talks in God's name. And he tells him, God says, I made you king. I gave you the king's kingdom. I took the kingdom away from Shaul and I gave it to you. And I had complete trust in you. And here you have gone and despised the commandment of God, and you've done evil by having Uriah killed and by taking his wife to be your wife. That's like the lamb in the parable. And God makes it very, very clear how upset he is at David. And he says, as a consequence, therefore the sword will not depart from your household. Meaning that there would be violence in David's house, not just during his lifetime, but throughout the history of the house of David. There would be rebellions and violence from within the household. And he says, I will raise up evil from your house. And he says, because you did this whole thing in secret, all of this will come out in public. Obviously, it's a very, very harsh we'll use the word punishment / consequence. As always, we could ask, is this punishment coming from God? Or is this what we'll call a measure for measure consequence for what David had done, especially this last thing, that you thought you could do all this in secret and no one would know? You don't know that God knows everything? Like, okay, maybe you thought you could pull this off that society wouldn't know, but to think that I wouldn't know? So here, it's a combination of God reacting and telling him these are the consequences. So here in the 13th verse, though, we have a very, very important thing. Vayomer David el Natan chatati lashem. David is listening this whole time. At the end, he says, I have sinned to God. And then immediately, God says to the prophet, tell him you will not die. And your sin has been commuted, but not the consequences of your sin. So this is obviously a very, very important point. He says, the son that you have just born with Batsheva will die. And he leaves it at that. David then goes and starts to pray for this child. And what happens is he wouldn't eat. He laid on the ground. He understood his responsibility. As we're going to go back over this whole story. David is trying here to do tshuva. He understands what he's done. He admits it. And he's trying to do tshuva, and he's trying to save his son. But his son dies. And the servants are afraid to go tell David because they see that how invested he is in trying to save this child. But they can't leave David like this. And so they basically tell him. And then what happens in the servant's eyes is something strange. David says, as soon as he hears that the son has died, so he says, he got up from the ground, he washed himself, he anointed himself. These are things you can't do in a state of mourning. And he changed his clothes. Now, we learn a lot about mourning practices from this incident, that a person during the 7 days, and even some of these things during the 30 days, you can't do. The idea of washing and what clothes you're allowed to wear and anointing yourself, these things you can't do during the 7-day period, and some of them during the 30-day period. But he does them. He gets up and he asks them to bring him food. He's been fasting this whole time. And this is connected to when what's called Sudat Havra'ah. When a person returns from the cemetery, the community actually makes food and the person is supposed to eat. And this is one of the sources from it. As long as the child was alive, he was fasting. But as soon as the child had died, then he had permission to eat. And that's why when we come back from a funeral, the people who are mourning eat along with the whole community. And again, this is one of the sources. And so the 12th chapter continues, and he explains to them, he says, as long as the child was alive and I thought I could influence God through my prayers, I fasted. I laid on the ground. But now that it's done, I can't do anything anymore. And so therefore, now I can eat. And it says that David went and he comforted Batsheva, and they had relations, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Shlomo, to King Solomon. Now, again, between the lines, obviously, time passes. We're reading it as if it's happening one thing after another. And he sent for Natan the prophet, and it says, one second. It says, and David called his son Shlomo. He called his son Shlomo, comes from the word shalom, shalem. And it says that God loved this child. God loved this child. And God sent Natan to go back to David and say that David is calling him Yedidiah, which comes from the word my beloved. Now, Yedidiah is actually the same root as David. David also means my beloved, Dodi, Lecha Dodi, like we say on Erev Shabbat. And then chapter 12 just ends with Yoav finishing this war against Ammon. So here we have in chapters 11 and 12, the whole story of David and Batsheva. I just told over the simple understanding. There's a lot of depths. So we're going to start tonight. It's clear to me that we will not be able to finish. So we're going to go back and try to understand this whole story. So first of all, there's an important midrash that it kind of colors this whole story. And that is that David at one point says to God, God, how come in the future, David is a prophet, how come in the future we'll refer to Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov? This is how we begin the Amidah, the standing prayer. Why does it say the God of Avram, the God of Yitzchak, and the God of Yaakov, and it doesn't include the God of David? In other words, David wanted to be among the same level as the patriarchs, the Avot. Now, what's interesting is on a certain level, he was on that level. How do we know that? When we read the Haftorah, so there's a series of one blessing before the Haftorah and a series of blessings after the Haftorah. One of them is Baruch Atah Hashem Magen David. Just like in the first blessing of the Amidah, where we begin by saying Baruch Atah Hashem Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. Then it continues, but we end it Baruch Atah Hashem Magen Avraham. So David merited to have a blessing on this, almost on the same level of Avram. Magen Avraham, Magen David. And there's another tradition that, and this goes with those who have been following our Tuesday class, Ma'aseh Merkavah. We're told that God's throne has 4 legs. Who are the 4 legs of God's throne? Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and David. So here, when David is asking God, like, kind of in the future, I can see there'll be this expression, the God of Avram, the God of Yitzhak, God of Yaakov. I also, please include me, the God of David. God answers him in this midrash and says, well, there's a difference between you and them. What is the difference? I tested them. We know Avram by tradition had 10 tests. Yaakov, it's not, they're not delineated as tests officially, but Yaakov's whole life was one test after another, one test of another. Yitzchak had probably the greatest test of all. The 10th test of Avram is actually called on Yitzchak's name, Akedat Yitzchak. So God says to David, I tested all of the Avot. And so David very sincerely, almost innocently says, so test me too. And the Midrash ends by saying, and God sent him the test of Batsheva. So that, again, we went through the whole story as it's written here, but there's a lot behind it. And so this whole incident is we'll call it in the context of David, truthfully, when I say innocently and sincerely, he just wanted to be close to God. He wanted to be as close as the patriarchs. He wanted God to acknowledge his love for God to be on the level of the patriarchs. It wasn't we could read it somewhat of like an egotistical request by David, but not really. David just really wanted that all of his, we'll call it Avodat Hashem, would be on the level of Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. In fact, there's another teaching where a person is encouraged to ask, when will my deeds be like the deeds of Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov? And so David is just doing that. He wants his deeds to be on the same level. So that is our kind of introduction to this whole idea. Now we'll bring another teaching, and that is that it says in the Gemara that Batsheva was destined from David from Maaseh Bereshit. From the inception of creation, David and Batsheva were destined for each other. They were soulmates on the highest level. So what went wrong here? So the expression that the Gemara uses is achal paga. He ate the fig early. That expression, it means to eat a fig before it's ripened. If you know, the way figs grow is they're very, very hard for a long time. But when it's time for them to get ripe, they ripen very, very quickly. And so the expression paga, achal paga, he ate the fig early, is he couldn't wait till it was properly ready to eat. And so this has a very, very important connection. This is a teaching that probably many of you have heard, but this is the time to say it, that there are, one second. There are three major sins that occur because of a lack of patience. three of the most cardinal sins in all of history. Adam and Chava could not wait till Shabbat to eat from the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra. And we're also told between the lines that they couldn't wait to have intimate relations until Shabbat. And we're told that if they would have waited and refrained from eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil and having relations, that once Shabbat came, they could have eaten first from the tree of life and then from the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra. Their mistake was they didn't have patience, and they ate from the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, before eating from the tree of life. This is a whole teaching, is that the Torah is called the tree of life. We say it every time we return the Torah to the ark, when we read it publicly. Eitz chaim hi l'machazikim ba. The Torah is a tree of life for those who grasp onto it. Had they eaten from the tree of life first, they would have understood how to deal with the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra. But the whole thing here, though, is the lack of patience. And I'm including this idea of their having intimate relations because it's connected to David not having patience. He saw, as soon as he saw her, David was a prophet. As soon as he saw her, yes, it mentioned she was a beautiful woman. But what he saw is, I am absolutely meant to marry this woman. I am destined to marry her. But we're told already, and this is one of the key parts of the story, she was married. And so he didn't have if he saw prophetically, I am meant to be with Batsheva, he would also have understood that circumstances would work themselves out that he would be able at some point to marry her. Now, this will become a key point of the story, and I'm going to try to get it to tonight, to at least mention it. So there's two of the sins and the whole thing of using this expression that David, achal paga, he ate the fig before it was ripe. So if you remember, there's a discussion in the Gemara, what fruit was the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra? What was the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? There's a number of possibilities that are given. One is that it was grape, and from there comes wine, and a very deep connection with the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Another one was it was wheat, and another one was it was fig. And in fact, the one that has the most, call it textual backing, is the fig. Why? Because as soon as they ate from it, it says they took a leaf from the fig tree and they covered themselves. So here's the connection between these two sins. I should mention that according to tradition, David is one of the main incarnations of Adam, and Batsheva is an incarnation of Chava, of Eve. The third sin, where impatience caused it, was the breaking of the tablets. Moshe was supposed to come down today on Yud Zayin B'Tammuz with the first tablets. And the first tablets were written with the finger of God. And according to all accounts, it was on a higher level than the second tablets. But the people couldn't wait, that there was a slight mix-up between Moshe and the people as to exactly when Moshe was coming back. Supposedly he was coming back on the 40th day, but in the people's mind, he was 6 hours late. They panic and they say, what are we going to do without Moshe? He's not coming back. We have to make new gods. And the whole story of the Egel Zahav, the golden calf, occurs because the people did have patience. So these three sins are held that there's a connection. Adam and Eve couldn't wait, the people couldn't wait, and David couldn't wait. So this is very, very important, especially understanding why the sages picked this phrase that David taking Batsheva when apparently it was not the right time, was he ate the fig early. Now, there's one other point I want to make, and of course, we are going to continue next week learning many, many other deep things about this whole incident of David and Batsheva. But this is one of the most important, and I do want to mention it right now, is that David says, Chatati Lashem, I sinned to God. Now, what's interesting here is God had said, because you had Uriah killed and you took the wife of Uriah. Now, how do the sages understand this? So there's a very, very famous statement from the sages. And they say, anyone who thinks that David sinned is mistaken. Now, the first question is, how could they say that? David himself says, I have sinned. God came and even told him what the sins were. But the sages say, anyone who says that David sinned is mistaken. What are they basing it on? So they're basing it on two things. And like I said, we'll continue this discussion. The first thing is that they claim, and apparently they have a tradition, and they didn't make this up just for David, that when a soldier in the Jewish army used to go to war, he would give his wife a get. He would give her a divorce document. Why? Because and we have the same problem today. If a person disappears, dies, there's no witnesses, no one knows if they died, if they not, a woman can't get remarried. If there's no proof that her husband has died, or he refuses to give her a get, she can't remarry. She's called what's called an aguna. This is a huge problem till this day. That will be a different discussion. But here, the sages say, even though it appears that she was married at the time that he had relations with her, she was not married because her husband was off at war. He had given her, it's called like a get on tonight. If he comes back, then the get is annulled. But if he doesn't come back, she's considered divorced from the time that he gave it to her. So here we have, there's a little gray area here because Uriah only died after they had relations. But others hold that the the divorce is valid from the time that he gave it to her. And so therefore, the sages say anyone who wants to claim that this was an adulterous relationship is mistaken. That at the time that he had relations with her, she was actually divorced, technically divorced. What about killing Uriah? So there is a law that if someone disobeys a commandment of the king, he has the right to kill them. Now, usually that is when they do something like terrible against the king is given the right by Jewish law to have that person killed. Here, again, the sages are leaning on that David told Uriah twice what to do. And even though Uriah felt that he wasn't doing anything wrong, in fact, he felt he was doing the opposite. He was showing his loyalty and love to the king and to the army. And there's also at one point where he refers to Yoav, the general, as basically his master, and not to David. And so for all of these reasons, the sages want to claim that technically David had the right to have Uriah killed. So that's why they say anyone who says that David sinned is mistaken. So that is what the Gemara says. And they base it on these two laws that could be used to explain that David did not sin. Nonetheless, what's the problem that we have here? The text seems to think otherwise. The text seems to state that God himself considered this a sin. But the question is, what sin? What level of sin? And that's where the debate comes in, where the sages would claim that, yes, David did not go about this in the most ideal way. But to label David as an adulterer and as a murderer, that is not indicated. And also, even when you read the words here, you could understand that God is upset with David because he expects so much more from him. And the way that it's worded is the way you had Uriah killed, the way that you took Batsheva. And there's a little gray area here that could indicate that God was saying, David, I expected so much more from you. And this answers a very a deep question. As soon as he says, Chatati Lashem, the very next thing God says to Natan, tell him I have accepted his tshuva and he won't die. So now you might think, now what we're going to discuss, and again, we have a lot more, is David did tshuva for the rest of his life for this. And it's clear in the Psalms, and there is a specific Psalm that we'll get to next time, the 51st Psalm, where David says, my sin is in front of me always. David, the rest of his life, felt that more than anything, he had disappointed God. So we're going to end here, because this is going to give everyone a lot to think about. We're just starting the story. Again, we went through the the simple understanding of the whole story. Now we're going back to try to understand how all the pieces come together here. So here we brought three important ideas that how David came to this test of Batsheva, the midrash that he asked for a test. He didn't realize it would be the test of Batsheva. And he clearly failed that test. And second, we're trying to understand what exactly was the sin here. It's really not that clear. It needs a lot of thought to try to understand. And the last thing was seeing how David's impatience was in line with two other major sins that occurred because of impatience, with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and with the making of the golden calf. And so we'll end with this. Hopefully this will give everyone a lot to think about, and we will continue with the story of David and Batsheva next week.